Oh, sorry, I didn't say that before I was on, so that's all good. Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Just have your attention, please. All quiet, please. Thank you. Go ahead, have your notes out. We're going to continue on with civil rights. I'm looking at this and it's like, oh my gosh, ISATs, and it takes away half an hour from the days that we're getting together. And anyway, my goal is to finish this unit and then have a very small politics unit before the end of the year. But the end of the year is going to come very, very quickly. You might not think so, but it is. So here we go. Where we left off, we're still in equal protection. Equal protection. And I think it's about time we talk about this issue. It's very important. There comes a time in one's life we have to talk about this issue. So are you ready for this issue? It's a big, big issue. Why are you scared? If you're ever having a conversation with somebody, and you've been with them for a long time, it's time to talk about marriage. Marriage. This brings us together. That's right. Actually, I don't have, this picture doesn't even have the priest in there who's doing that one, the Princess Bride. I've got a bunch of clips, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to have to drop that clip, and so forth, in order for time and expedience and so forth, because, write this down, we're going to do a full analysis on the United States Supreme Court, Constitution, and marriage. And this has been a really interesting topic over the last number of years, very, very controversial. But it's a good example of this whole debate over judicial restraint versus judicial activism. For example, I'm going to be doing a survey with you. Yeah, I'm going to go through and actually ask you to show your hand. Sometimes it'll be this or this, sometimes it'll be this or this, and then we'll go down here, all the way as we look at various different criteria upon which a marriage could potentially be limited by the government, okay, as opposed to, people like in their own sort of things. Because sometimes people go like, I'm married to my, pet toy that you had growing up. And you're like, well, that's really interesting. I'm sure it's not a legal marriage. No, it's not, because I don't know of any state in the country that allows you to marry your doll. He's like, just wait. There's a movement. There's a petition going around. And actually, that is one of the questions that we're going to be asking. With respect to marriage and the laws, I'm going to be asking you, who do you think decides? And actually, we'll get answers as far as where things are right now. Well, I'm going to be asking as far as your internal consistency. Is there a consistency on either of these two questions? Who is going to decide ultimately whether or not there can be a marriage limitation based on, is it going to be the Supreme Court, right? Who are very powerful and almost untouchable, somewhat influenced by the opinions of the people around in the country, but not necessarily. Or are you going to be cool with having the elected leaders be in charge? Are they going to be ones that you trust to make the right decision on the issue of marriage limitation? And then when you get to actually deciding whether or not there should be a marriage limitation, is this something that you're like, oh, shut up, everybody, let people choose, individuals based on their own choice and so forth? This is kind of a summation. You'll see this as we go through. Or is the government really doing a very important thing by protecting the community from something that's going on that individuals might be making choices that is really not very good for the community, yada, yada, yada. So we'll see how that breaks down. And I want to go through this period and go through all the various different component parts, because this is really interesting stuff, okay? Very interesting stuff. First of all, write this down. Is marriage a right in the Constitution? Yes. Where? 9. Really? Does the 9th Amendment have the word marriage?
No, it's any other thing. Anything forgotten.
Anything forgotten? So, let me ask you this, Owen. Did that exist back in the time that the 9th Amendment was written?
Yeah.
It did? I mean, people were marrying?
Yeah.
Who?
People of the same race and of the opposite sex.
Okay.
and monogamous.
Okay. Oh, wow. Just go ahead and write that down. He's hitting all kinds of historical things. We've got historical facts. 2 people, adults. And in most of the places, to the extent that they have those laws, sometimes those laws are added later on and so forth, but it appears to be within the same sort of like racial community. Sometimes you will have laws limiting that, and there might be some other variances. Oh, the number. You can only have 1. I think we mentioned that. Okay? So there we go. And in fact, the Supreme Court, write that down, has said it's a fundamental right. So they agree as far as the 9th Amendment. It is a fundamental right. Okay? It was always fascinating historically because even in my legal career, Idaho changed. Once upon a time, people actually I won't say pretended, they acted as though they were married. So let's see, raise your hand if you know this one. Pretty smart. What is it called when you don't have somebody getting married in front of a judge or in front of like a priest or pastor or whatever, but they're just like, hey, we're hanging out and we're in the countryside and everyone knows we're married and we told each other we're married, so we're married. Common law. Common law. That was a thing in rural United States for many years, including rural Idaho. But that was when it was really hard to get into town to get all your paperwork done. They got rid of that because there was confusion, because sometimes people were like, no, I'm not common law married to you are, and you go, yes, you are. No, not you. And then they have to prove that, the one who wants the benefits, as it were, from the marriage, has to prove that the common law marriage existed, so that therefore they can get a divorce and so forth. Does that make sense? So, what are going to be, so that part's pretty much cleared up. But with respect to what kinds of rules and so forth are there, we're going to look at those, and we're going to see that this isn't just a legal issue. This is very much a societal thing. And it's a good example of how different groups of people who want things to change societally, legally, through the courts, through the elected officials, how they would operate. You're going to recognize some of this because it's going on in your lifetime. And it went on in my lifetime. Yes?
You say common law is no longer allowed. Are people who had been qualifying for the common law?
I think actually, I think in Idaho, I want to say, my understanding was you needed to get it on paper. Right? You couldn't just sort of go, oh yeah, we were common law married like 40 years ago. Get it in writing. Okay? Getting right. Because they wanted some reliability, some clear expectations, because otherwise it was just sort of, yeah. Now, do you have to? You can write this down. Like for a real simple thing. In Idaho, do you have to have a religious person supervise with respect to the marriage? No. Can you have a religious person carried out? Yes, and they're going to have the paperwork, and they're going to make sure that you get all the things signed and so forth. And then I think you pretty much have to take it to, to the county courthouse or whatever, and get it filed. Okay? All right. So, let's talk about some of the limitations. Some of you guys remember, actually I'm curious if any of you guys remember, there was a word that we used last year in the colonial period to describe a negative attitude toward the mixing of races with respect to procreation, marriage, whatsoever. And there was mixing, right? And there's mix. In fact, do any of you guys remember, what is it if you have European heritage and Native heritage? Remember that one?
Oh.
Remember that?
It starts with an E.
Starts with an M.
Listen.
Mestizo. Okay. And African American and European heritage was the mulatto. Okay. So you had this whole system and so forth. At the top, you had like all the whites, and then at the bottom, as far as like the social, so forth, you had people who were, African American, particularly in a slave situation. You had Native Americans and so forth. They were not really high up on the system. Anybody remember that word? Because they actually had laws. In fact, write this down. There were laws against this, and we're going to be talking about some of those laws. Laws against the interracial intimacy that could result in children. Laws against the marriage, interracial marriage. No, not eugenics. That's another word that's got a lot of negative history around it as far as like, oh, let's check your brain and see the size of your head and determine whether or not you are inferior intelligence and so forth. Miscegenation. You don't run into that word very much. I'll spell that for you. Misceg. I'm going to misspell this. A-T-I-O-N. Somebody can spell check that. Miscegenation. Miscegenation. M-I-S-C-E-G. Do I actually have that in there? I think I might have spelled that there for you. No, I didn't. I wrote interracial. Okay. Anyway, did I get it? Really? All right. Woohoo! I got spell check in my brain sometimes. All right. So miscegenation is a very negative term. And in fact, go ahead and write this down. At the same time, love this. At the same time that I was attending here we go. I was attending school in Virginia that was finally integrated by busing in Arlington County. This case came up just a few years earlier. It's the Loving case, okay, 1967. I tell you what, you can't beat that for a name. As far as a case having to do with marriage, why is it called the Loving case? Because the guy's last name was Loving, as was his wife. And they were married. Write it down. Mr. and Mrs. Loving were married in Washington, D.C. And they lived in Virginia. And Virginia had an anti-miscegenation law. As in, the law said that whites and blacks could not have intimacy, nor could they be married. That was a racist law in the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia had, I don't know when they created it, but they created it at some time. And I suppose they could uncreate it, right? So you could go to the elected leaders of the state of Virginia and say, hey, state of Virginia, right? These two people, he was a Marine veteran, and they both grew up in the nearby community, so they knew each other early on. They fell in love, and they wanted to be married. And they knew they couldn't be married in Virginia, so they got married in Washington, D.C. They made a movie out of it. I'll show you the trailer. And when they went to Washington, D.C., they got married. And they lived there for a while, and they were like, well, we want to live near family in Virginia. Well, they knew there was in danger of living near family in Virginia because they would be in violation of the Virginia law. Well, I suppose you get the Virginia law changed, maybe. I don't know. Or, here's what they tried to do. Get the Supreme Court to take the case. Will the Supreme Court take the case on a limitation by a state government on the ability of people to get married? Well, you know this. It's got a case name. It's got a date. The Supreme Court did take it. Let's go through the whole story, and then we'll ask you afterwards what you think should have been the case as far as how that plays out. Anyway, that's the case. The Supreme Court ruled in the favor of the two of them, right? Here's a quote from the decision. Marriage is one of the basic civil rights of man, fundamental to our very existence and survival. Honestly, do you think the Supreme Court that's not okay with segregation in public schools is going to be okay with legal segregation as far as like one's, potentially one's most ultimate personal choice in life, who your marriage partner is going to be? Yeah, they ruled in the favor of the Lovings. Okay, I'll show you the clip. It's a really good movie. Have you guys ever seen the movie? Yeah, I mean and I was watching. It was like, oh my gosh, this is way too dramatized. And then I did the research. I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, they really were arrested. They were seriously arrested in Virginia. Because the law enforcement, they're like, oh my gosh, you're flaunting the law. And they're like, yeah, we hate the law. We want to spend some time together. Hello. And Life magazine came out and did a pictorial and so forth. And the country went along. You can write this down. I mean, you guys are probably not too surprised. There were some people like, oh, that's terrible. There goes that, activist Supreme Court coming around telling states that they can't, make distinctions and so forth. Okay? Anyway, let's play the trailer for you, because it's a lovely trailer if you've never seen the movie. I think you'd like it. Yeah, they did a nice job on this. I like this.
I'm gonna build you a house. Right here. Our house. I wanna take matters up to this year, get married. You sure about that?
On the power vested in me by the District of Columbia, I now pronounce you husband and wife.
Get here. What you doing in there with that woman?
I believe this is a battle that could go all the way to the Supreme Court.
It did.
The state of Virginia will argue that it is unfair to bring children of mixed race into the world.
Tell that woman to come in here.
I'm gonna raise my family here. I don't care what they do to us.
I can take care of you.
I know that.
I can take care of you.
I know we have some enemies, but we have some friends too.
You realize this case could alter the Constitution of the United States.
Do you think you'll lose?
We may lose a small battle, but win a big war.
Is there anything you'd like me to say to the Supreme Court justices of the United States?
Yeah? Tell the judge I love my wife.
So, by show of hands, how many of you guys agree that with the United States Supreme Court decision finding anti-misogynistic laws unconstitutional? Yeah, I think that was a pretty compelling argument. Yeah, you're like, whoa, that was, whoa. So, I mean, this is kind of interesting, and this kind of keep an eye on this one. I'll go with this one first. How many of you guys, by show of hands, believe that, I'll kind of put it in the best light. If you just make your case to the elected officials in Virginia and so forth, they'll come with the times and so forth. Raise your hand if you're like, in this particular case, let the state decide whether or not there are racial distinctions in marriage laws. You're not going to, because this is an interesting one. Sometimes people are like, well, they're not with us right now, but eventually they will. You're like, any patience? No patience at all? You're like, you've had your opportunity to fix this law and you haven't done it? Okay, well then that would be a big 0 right here, okay? So nobody is like, I have faith with the legislature that they'll do the right thing. No, it's too imbued in there. How many of you guys are like, totally comfortable with the United States Supreme Court, talking about this and making a decision on this? Okay, so that's everybody. All right, we'll just go ahead and whatever number there is there. So how many of you guys, this is an interesting one, you're like, I can see how this is going to go. What were the arguments for anti-miscegenation laws? Go for it. I mean, you don't have to agree with it, but go for it.
The argument was that it was wrong to bring children of mixed race into the world.
Yeah. I mean, literally, sometimes you would hear them referred to as this is like, what would it be? It's mongrel. That was a word that was used sometimes. A mongrel, like a dog or something of like, mixed breed and so forth. Okay, is that your sister's name? That's so sweet. Yeah. So, how many of you guys believe that the government should protect the community from the choices of people who want to have relationships with each other of a varied skin tone? So, negatory on that one, okay, not surprised there. So I guess how many of you guys believe, because that's what they're saying, these are adults and they're making adult decisions and, they know, because, trust me, at that time, they knew, and that was one of the things that's cool about the movie. There was like the white community, some of them were not too cool with it, and the African American community, some of them were not too cool with it, even if part of their feeling is, just be careful because this is going to be difficult for you out in that world. You know what I'm saying? It's like, this is going to be hard for you, and we want to protect you, and if you stick with your own kind, yada, yada, then you'll be safer and a lot happier and so forth. Okay? So that was individual choice. Let them decide. All right? Well, here's an interesting thing. As far as this went along, this case came up at a time when there was a lot going on in social attitudes and entertainment attitudes relative to African Americans in the community, in the United States. Here's a little primer for you. You can write this down. If you want to win over the Supreme Court, you're going to need to get some of the American people alongside of you. Otherwise, they'll be like, I don't know, maybe we're not going to step out. Because they don't like to step out too far. Sometimes they'll step out a little ways, sometimes maybe, depending on how you look at it, quite a ways ahead of the public opinion. But if you're trying to get an expansion or a change of heart of the population, one of the most effective ways is to change the perceptions in entertainment media. Okay? This is always going on. This is going on around you. We're going to touch on that sometimes. Let's start with, for example, boy howdy, some of you guys might remember this. We talked about this. Actually, this would have been in the online portion of the Reconstruction part, after African Americans got their freedom in the 14th and 13th and 14th Amendments. This was a popular movie. You can just write this, make a little note of this. This was a popular movie that came out in 1915. It was Birth of a Nation. It's got a terrible, terrible reputation now because it is an extremely racist movie. At the time, as far as like filmmaking techniques, appreciate this, it was like way ahead of its time as far as filmmaking techniques, and others would follow it. Like, for example, the cutaways. That was something they hadn't really done before. And D.W. Griffiths, the filmmaker, he would like have two pieces of action going on. And you'll see this in a sense in the part that I'm going to show you. So you got action going on here, and then you cut away to action going on there. You know, they do that in stories where they kind of cut to this and cut to this, and they do that in the movie. So here's the outline of the movie, of the story here. It is extremely racist. Basically, the good guys are white, and the bad guys are Northern Yankees and black people. Okay? It tells the story. The movie tells the story prior to, during the Civil War, and particularly the time after the Civil War, when the people who were oppressed were the Southern whites in the story. Okay? So, I mean, that's the story. Right? So, for example, and in the movie, it's kind of like this man right here. You're going to see him. He's an African American. He's in the Union Army. He's not actually African American. He's a white person in blackface, playing an African American. Okay? All right, so here we go. Oh, you haven't even seen it yet. All right, so here is the young woman who is, just the beloved heroine in the movie, and she's loved by the beloved male in the movie who was a member of association who's going to take care of things after things go wrong. Well, this guy right here approaches her, and you'll see, I'm going to show you this. I've got it on 2-speed because it's like, oh my God, quick, seriously. You're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and do it already. He wants to get married to her. He's interested in getting married to her, okay? I don't know, can you imagine that? Talk about epic fails. You ever seen those things like at sporting events where like somebody proposes to somebody? And they say no. That's terrible. Don't do that, please. Do not do that. Epic fail. Yeah, exactly. Do not pressure. It's an important enough decision. Yeah. Yeah. You're just like, no. Yeah. So, yeah, anyway, so the scene you're going to see here, I'll play for a little bit here. He's approaching her, and then she's not really interested, so she runs away. All right? So meanwhile, her boyfriend's like, where's she going? And there's like a trail of things because, gosh, so conveniently, he drops something. This guy seems to lose like half of his clothing along the way, which is very helpful to trace like where they're going along. His coat, then his hat, and so forth. And eventually, you can figure this part out. Eventually, she figures out that the best place to run away, to get away from this pursuing African American, is the high pinnacle, rocky outcrop of a mountain. That's a really good, safe place to hang out. And of course, he's pursuing her, and he's like, I just want to, anyway. So what's she going to do? Well, I'll let you see. Okay, here we go. Birth of a Nation. And I've got it on 2-speed. All right, so here he is approaching her. Ah, here's the marriage proposal. Can you actually tell that I've got it on double speed? I do. Because I already have it speeded up. This is a real movie. This was the most popular movie when it came out. Huge audiences. Pretty much all white Americans. African Americans were not happy with this movie for obvious reasons. Where did she go? I think she's over here. Maybe she's that way. Oh, she's running away. Sounds much better. The music sounds better when it's on 2-speed. The long, thoughtful pauses are still too long. I'm going up to the top. Don't follow me. Oh, I dropped my hat. As a convenient. Go away. He's like, no, I can persuade you. Yeah, and actually, I'm not going to keep it going because she's got this long, drawn-out, like, death scene and so forth, but eventually she dies, and then he forms up a group. He forms up a group, you know, and with his thing, the KKK, because they come in, riding to the rescue and so forth, and then they get the black guy, they kill him, and they dump his body on the Attorney General's doorstep because, or Lieutenant Governor, okay, because they're basically saying, you know, this, because this is during that time period when African Americans could vote, and they were electing people to office, and so this is an argument for why African Americans shouldn't vote, and all those restrictions on African American voting rights were completely justified because they were bringing in like a terrible base of civilization to the Deep South. Woo! Did you get all that? So this was in 1915. I think the KKK membership in the country actually kind of peaked at about that time. It had a resurgence and so forth in this country and spread into all kinds of various different areas. Wow, so you're like, was that part of U.S. history? Yeah, sure. Gone with the Wind, when that came out in 1939, portrayed, do you remember African Americans as like heroic, courageous? Yeah, and actually her role was not too bad. The one who was like, I don't know nothing about birth and no babies and so forth. And Disney did Song of the South, you know, including minstrel shows. And anyway, so 1967, same year as The Loving Case, right? Yeah, 67. Here's a popular film that came out, and this is interesting because Hollywood's taken a direct effort to include an African American in a positive portrayal. In this case, you have Sidney Poitier as the African American, a doctor. All right, so a well-established profession with a lot of resources and so forth, and he and his girlfriend fall in love, and her parents are liberal, white people, played by Katharine Hepburn and Spencer Tracy, excuse me. And so this is like, how do people deal with this issue of if an African American wants to be potentially joining into your family? Like, how's that going to go? So this is one of those Hollywood treatments, and is he going to be portrayed very positively? Are you kidding? Yeah, Sidney Poitier. He was the one that was chosen to play Thurgood Marshall in the movie clip that I showed you there. So I'll show you the trailer for this one. Guess Who's Coming for Dinner? A much more positive portrayal of African American, certainly in the context of, you know, a doctor joining, you know, a well-to-do white family. Is that going to be okay? Here's a movie trailer clip.
Starring Academy Award winner Spencer Tracy, Academy Award winner Sidney Poitier, Academy Award winner Katharine Hepburn. Introducing Catherine Hope.
And her.
3 Academy Award winners and a bright young newcomer combine their talents in a love story of today.
I haven't even told you his name. Mom, it's John Wade Prentice. Isn't that a lovely name? John Wade. Joanna Prentice, Auntie.
Wade, I think he said.
What the hell is going on here?
I love your daughter. There is nothing I wouldn't do to try to keep her as happy as she was the day I met her. But it seems to me, without your approval, we will make no sense at all. That is why I'm asking for the clearest possible statement of what your attitude is going to be.
I appreciate that, Doctor. It's almost in the form of an alma mater.
Not quite, Mr. Drayton. All you have to say is goodbye.
You mean if we've been to bed together? I don't mind you asking me that. We haven't. He wouldn't.
Until today, I would never have believed that I could say such a thing. But when she fights you, I'm going to be on her side.
Oh.
But you don't own me. You can't tell me when or where I'm out of line, or try to get me to live my life according to your rules.
You're my father. I'm your son. I love you. But you think of yourself as a colored man. I think of myself as a man.
Got a very 60s musical soundtrack. The story of love. Right, so here we go. This is an interesting one. Sometimes they'll do surveys. I'll do a survey here. You guys get a volunteer to participate in a survey. This is one of those measurements of racial tolerance sort of thing, you know. I mean, they would ask questions like, you know, are you okay with having people of a different race in your neighborhood, in your employment? Okay, and they would sort of like, you know, upgrade it. We'll go straight to the winner chicken dinner question for you. Here, everyone, answer me this question. Are you okay, potentially, because we don't know, there's a lot of other factors and so forth, having a lifelong intimate relationship with somebody regardless of their skin color? How many of you guys are cool with that? How many of you guys are like, negatory on that? Yeah, and I mean, this is actually, yeah, over the last several years, quite some time now, your generation is kind of like, who cares? I mean, honestly, who cares? Some things would matter even more. How many of you guys could potentially have a lifelong relationship with somebody who had attended school at the University of Idaho? How many of you guys couldn't? You're like, oh. How many of you guys couldn't have somebody who like attended Boise State University? Because there's, I don't know. How many of you guys know what I'm talking about? No, I don't. Hey, hey, hey. Be nice. Hey. Oh my gosh, seriously, that's rude. All right. Shh. Okay. Do we have Lizzie? Yes, we do. All right, so here's the deal. Okay. Where was I? Where was it really interrupted? Oh, yeah. How many of you guys know people that are so into like a particular college or football? Could you have a lifelong relationship with somebody who was a huge opponent of the Pittsburgh Steelers? I see to be honest. Yeah. I mean, if they're neutral, is it possible? Yeah, because you'll have time to work them over. It's kind of like when I was growing up and so forth, I was just like, Cowboys, because they're a big arch rival of the Washington Redskins, my team, before they have no name, and I don't even know what their name is going to be in the future. But that's a huge rival. So I'm with you, Max. Could I picture spending the rest of my life with a Cowboys fan? I don't think so. My wife's a Seahawks fan. That's okay, Although we have to be in different households when they play playoff games because it's anyway. So, but here we go. This was fascinating. I'm going to share with you because I'm a U of I fan. It's got the Vandals. I was going to law school, Boise State. It's where I got my teaching credentials and so forth. This was cool. Did any of you guys see this? 2007, the Fiesta Bowl, like the first time Boise State playing the Fiesta Bowl, and we're going up against Oklahoma, and they're all bad, and they're all like, you suck, Boise State. And we're doing really well, and we're like beating them, and then we fall behind, and we're like, oh, wow, we're going to lose. And then we pull it off. We pull off, we do this crazy play in the last minutes of the game, and then we tie it up, and we go into overtime, and then they score. And then we get the ball, and we score. And instead of going for a 1 point to tie it up, we go for the 2-point conversion. The quarterback gets the ball. It's like he's throwing it, but he has the ball in this hand, and he hands it off to Ian Johnson. And he runs around the left side, and he's running around the left side, and he runs in the end zone, and he scores, and he throws the ball into the stands, like whatever. And then he's like crazy. It's like everyone's going crazy. It's so exciting and everything. And his girlfriend's there, and his girlfriend's one of the cheerleaders and so forth. He was thinking about it, and he did. He actually told the Fox News sports reporter, I'm going to ask my girlfriend, Chrissy Papadix, to get married.
Where did you go, right?
Yeah. I don't think he had her with him at that time. This is not going to be an epic fail because they kind of already reached that sort of mutual understanding that, yeah, you know, and so forth. So they do it on live television. I'm going to play this. They do it on live television. The Fox guy totally screws it up because he tells her that he's like, oh, you're going to be asking her to marry. And he's like, oh, he really is. So here we go. Let's play it. Woo! This is in Arizona. These are your neighbors, by the way, or maybe you. Does that look like you guys? What? No, he totally blew it. She said yes. And they flew him back to New York to appear on all these talk shows. Isn't that sweet? Isn't that? Aww. Isn't that sweet? So this is an indication of where we've come. In all of the discussion and so forth afterwards, not once did I hear, what have we been talking about? Yeah. I didn't hear anything about that. Yeah. He is African American, at least in part. Yeah. She's white. Was it an issue? No. Nobody cares about it. Right? I mean, the Supreme Court had knocked out that thing. I don't even think that even existed in Idaho and so forth. So we're past that. Isn't that good? Yeah. That's all good. So now, write this down. The Supreme Court has said, if the case is right, we're going to get involved when it comes to marriage restrictions. So what was coming up next? Same-sex marriage restrictions. Write this down. Same-sex marriage restrictions. Okay? You're going to go, wow, you're so old, Mr. Hans. Because when I started teaching, if you were a same-sex couple, you couldn't get married anywhere in this country. Nowhere. Nowhere. Now know this. Make sure you have this. It's pretty much left up to the states. Okay? Just like the anti-miscegenation laws and so forth that exist in Virginia, some other southern states and so forth, but not really in other states. Every state has its own unique kind of marriage rules. I mean, they're basically about the same-ish. But if you go back like 20 years ago, same-sex couples couldn't get married in any state. Okay? Was there an effort to get same-sex marriage accepted by change of law in elected leaders of different states? Of course there was. Okay? And in fact, that's where it was accomplished first. In, I don't know, take a guess. Which state would be more likely to legally allow for same-sex marriage to take place? Vermont or Idaho? Hawaii or Wyoming? Yeah. So some of the first ones, you can write this down. Historically, some of the first states were among the states that are referred to generally as more liberal. Okay. So you got some in the Northeast, some on the West Coast. Hawaii is a little bit more liberal and so forth. And it was interesting because as that was taking place, it was an interesting thing because I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be a problem. Because what if you get married in one state? Will another state have to recognize that when you move there? That's an interesting question. How much can a state say, well, that's fine for y'all living over there, but not okay here? You understand that? And it actually never came up. The Supreme Court never ruled on that. It never ruled on that. What they did rule on, ultimately, was in this Windsor case in 2013. The federal government passed a law called the Defense of Marriage Act. And this is actually during the presidency, I want to say, of President Clinton. Because if you looked at the politicians in this country and said, who is in favor of same-sex marriage and who is opposed, well, let's go back about halfway. George H.W. Bush, opposed. Bill Clinton, opposed. George W. Bush, opposed. Barack Obama, initially, opposed. Okay? And in fact, this federal law basically said the federal government was stepping in and saying no state has to, or excuse me, the federal government is not going to give you federal recognition for a state same-sex marriage if you happen to be from one of those first states, Maine, Vermont, what have you. Okay? Do you understand that? So, as a practical matter, when you're filling out your taxes, most of the time there is a financial benefit to filing as a married couple if you're married in that state. And if you file as a married couple, you would file so on your state taxes and on your federal taxes. Do you understand? You're like, oh my gosh, what's all this tax nonsense thing? Well, the defense, DOMA, said you couldn't file as a married couple if you were from a state that allowed for same-sex marriage. Okay? It was challenged in the courts. Write this down. It was challenged in the United States Supreme Court, 2013, and it was interesting because the Windsor case said on a 5-4 decision, right? So it's very close, 5-4 decision, that the Defense of Marriage Act was unconstitutional. That restricted the rights of people who were same-sex marriage if that state allowed it. Well, the Supreme Court was almost sort of like telegraphing where it might actually come down on any state that didn't allow for same-sex marriage. Because that was the ultimate goal. And this was a fascinating thing politically, bless you. This was taking place, you don't hear that much discussion about it now, but oh my gosh, there was a lot of discussion once upon a time. So by 2014, this is an interesting one, take a look at there. The dark blue, by 2014, same-sex marriage is allowed, okay? And typically, what you had was the legislatures of those states allowing for same-sex marriage. And if you're looking at here, you've got kind of a concentration of Northeast states, West Coast states, some in the Midwest. Now, then then, of course, write this down, the courts. Advocates for same-sex marriage were not fighting just over here. No, what did they want? Did they want same-sex marriage to be allowed, state by state by state over a long period of time, everywhere all at once? Well, who can give that everywhere all at once kind of ruling? The U.S. Supreme Court, okay? The United States Supreme Court. And eventually you had court cases popping up all over the place. And there was one court case that ultimately made its way to the Supreme Court. I mean, literally, the legal strategy of the same-sex marriage advocates, they were filing lawsuits in every state that did not allow for same-sex marriage, hoping that one of them would make its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, and did it. 2015, here we go. That's the name of the case, Obergefell versus Hodges, okay? And when you're bringing a case, you generally, as a tactical matter, you want your plaintiffs, okay, your people, to be in the most factually sympathetic condition possible. So here you had two men who wanted to get married in a state, I want to say it was like a Midwest state, I want to say like Kentucky or Indiana, somewhere like that. I always forget. And one of them has I forget what his condition is, but he's basically immobilized. Okay, and the other fellow is not. And they wanted to get married under the laws of that state, and they were not allowed to, so it made its way all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. Okay? All right, you guys know the ruling. Does anyone not know the ruling? Did the Supreme Court rule in favor of the same-sex couple that they have a right under the Constitution to get married? Yes, you can write that down, 2015. Some of you guys remember the advocates of same-sex marriage were like, woo, this is great, and you would see through social media and so forth all kinds of different representations. Typically, what would be a typical representation for somebody who was celebrating the Obergefell versus Hodges? I'll go to you. What would be a typical color arrangement in favor of that? The rainbow, exactly. Yes, the rainbow. It's always fascinating because, I don't know, I think it's sort of lots of different, you know? I mean, it's a nice, yeah. I mean, as far as choosing something, I mean, Adolf Hitler, he wants this real tough symbol and so forth, so he chose a cross with bends in it and red and black and so forth. If you're advocating for more inclusiveness in society and so forth and yada yada, rainbow probably makes a lot of sense. Okay, I don't know, maybe sparkles or something in there too, but whatever. Yeah, so there you go. And you see it in the sky when the rain is stopped. So, curious on this one. This one's a kind of interesting one. Shh. Because as that decision was being reached, oh, and by the way, write this down. It was 5-4. It was a 5-4 decision. Yeah. And in fact, it was interesting because one of the conservative justices who was on the dissenting side in the Windsor case said, I can see the other shoe is about to fall. In other words, he's like, I see where this court is going to go. And he was right. Okay, he was the one who died and during Obama's time, and Obama was not able to appoint the replacement. It was Scalia who said that. It was conservative justice. Anyway, Scalia was ultimately, his position was filled by Kavanaugh, another conservative. Anyway, what he said in this 5-4, what the decision was in this 5-4 decision is the pushback from a lot of the dissenters was, okay, now the Supreme Court has really stepped into this quite a bit. This should have been left up to the states. This is a very important public policy decision that should be left up to lawmakers, because if you go too far down this path of the Supreme Court always stepping in, you don't know where that's going to be. The so-called, you can write it down, slippery slope argument. The slippery slope argument. As in, you know how this works. Do it with parents. If your parents give you this much, can you take more? Using the argument of precedent that, well, you said this was okay, so why not this? Why not that? Why not that? Once you start going down the slippery slope, where do you usually end up? At the bottom, because it's slippery, right? Once you head on that path, woo! Another analogy is the camel's nose in the tent. This works very much in North African scenarios. You guys are like, what the heck, the camel's nose in the tent? All right, imagine you are living in North Africa on the Sahara. It's hot in the day, it's cold at night. Your camels, do you treat your camels well? Of course you do. You want to treat your camels well because your camels are very, very important. Well, in the desert at night it gets cold. Are you going to let the camels come into the tent with you? You're so nice. Do you know how big a camel is and how big your tent is? Libby's like, oh, it's a really big, and it's stinky. So here's the deal, all right? So Ben, what if your camel speaks to you? You got a talking camel, and your camel's like, I am happy being outside, but if I could just warm my little nose. If I could just warm my little nose. Just allowing a little nose. It's a little nose going to be too much space? Too much stinky? But if you let a little nose of a camel inside of a tent, what is likely to happen next? The rest of the camel will make its way into the tent because the camel's like, my nose is feeling good, and the rest of the camel's body is going, okay, let's go on in it. So it's, in other words, it's kind of that inevitability type argument. Okay? Let me ask you guys. Let's do the survey. Here we go. So, on this one, The question is, on this one, not saying how the decision should be made, although that may influence your response here. Should this question of allowing for same-sex marriage and so forth, allowing or not allowing, should it have been left up to the publicly elected officials? And again, that would be sort of a state by state by state by state. Arguably, states like Idaho, Utah might have been, if at all, among the last states to allow for same-sex marriage, if you do it incrementally that way. Do you understand what I'm saying? Or should it have been, let the Supreme Court make a decision for the entire country? It's a constitutional case there. Do you understand what I'm asking? Okay, show of hands. How many of you guys would say, let the elected officials? Let the elected officials. Nobody? Okay. Well, here's the thing. Actually, you could say nothing was happening, but in fact, it was happening. And in fact, you can write this down. In fact, the analysis of the Supreme Court case was the court felt like the trend had been moving at such a rate that they weren't getting too far out ahead of public opinion, so they wouldn't necessarily be punished so much when that decision was made. Okay, do you understand that? And in fact, it's very interesting because after that decision was made, has that been an issue in like major political party things, presidential campaigns, to like undo that? Not that much. I mean, a little bit, but not that much. In fact, President Trump and so forth, he's like, I don't think so. A lot of conservative justices are like, this one's kind of gone, because maybe, arguably, if you let this go a little bit further, you would have a few more states, bit by bit by bit, and some might take a little bit longer. So, but nobody. So all of y'all are okay with the Supreme Court stepping in? Okay? All right. Usually it's been interesting over the years. We'll get some numbers in here, and in fact, before that decision was made, you get a lot more numbers there. Let's see if that follows here. Yeah. So, what was the argument as far as like the government had was right in potentially not allowing same-sex marriage? Unnatural, it's not traditional, things like that and so forth. Okay? How many of you guys how many of you guys think that the government should protect the community and not allow for same-sex marriage? Okay, if you're all here, then so you say it's an individual adult choice? All right, so we've seen some consistency here. Let's see how long this lasts. We're seeing some consistency. Okay? Let the adults decide. So far, that's what you're saying? And let the Supreme Court come in. If some of those politicians are a little bit too slow, too bad on them. All right, perfect. Let's go to the next case. All right? Well, once the Supreme Court makes a decision, in fact, this came up in the arguments for the Obergefell case. Once the Supreme Court makes a decision, what's the next case? Well, the next issue here is polygamy. Write it down. Numbers. This is where it's coming. This is where the argument is. People in favor of polygamy, you can have more than one spouse legally. People in favor of polygamy are looking at what you guys have done, the Supreme Court has done, and said, the Supreme Court should step in. The Supreme Court should base their decision on its individual choices. And that there is no need to protect the community. And in fact, here we go on television. Who are these people? Sister wives, okay? And it's very interesting because, and I'll answer this question to save anyone else this issue, okay? Oh my gosh, I was like, within the history of the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, was there polygamy in the early days? Yes, there was, absolutely. When did it go away? Like about 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. And in fact, yeah, there were offshoots. Ivan, if you were in an offshoot, I think this is like the FLDS. Yeah, there are a lot of offshoots. Yeah, it's like, within faith and so forth, you got two. So anyway, these guys are not in the traditional group of Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints. They're in an offshoot. Now, I want to say like Nevada or Arizona or someplace like that. So, here's the deal, though. Write this down. Can they get married? No, there is no state that allows for polygamy. There's no state. There's no state. Can they hold themselves, without getting to putting too fine a term on it, can they behave in such a way that married people do? Can they cohabitate? Can they have intimacy? Can they have children? Yes, and here it's kind of like we're jumping to the head, and you're like, really? Because there's laws that say you can't do that. Well, guess what? The Supreme Court has already ruled in Lawrence versus Texas, and we'll come back to this, we'll swing back around to this one, you're like, whoa, where did that come from? In 2003, the United States Supreme Court threw out a Texas law prohibiting what is called, it's a so-called anti-sodomy law. In other words, Texas had a law that basically said if you were married, or actually if you're an adult and so forth, there were certain ways of connecting. To use the Lego analogy, I don't want to go put too fine a point on this and so forth, but if you can imagine traditional male and female Lego, if they come together in such a way that could lead to children and what have you, okay? But there's other ways that Legos can come together, and you're like, what are you talking about? Anyway, if boy Legos and boy Legos, that is against the law in Texas, okay? That was against the law in Texas, and if you ever rent, know who your landlord is, because sometimes your landlord can let people into the building, into your room. And in fact, the landlord in Texas let local law enforcement into the room, into the apartment where the men were breaking Texas law. And they said that they had a right to do that. They had a right to be intimate in the fashion that they were. And the Supreme Court, we haven't even gotten to the right of privacy yet, but the Supreme Court said, why, yes, they do. Do you understand that? Which is a huge thing, because when you're talking about marriage, I mean, marriage is like marriage, but the Supreme Court has already let the animals out of the barn. Because all the stuff that is intimate within a marriage, as far as adults go, the Supreme Court says, it's all legal. Lawrence versus Texas. Do you understand that? So, they can't be under, Lawrence versus Texas is actually one of the last cases in the thing. We'll get back to the right of privacy. The right of privacy cases involve right to have an abortion and so forth, but it's from that line of cases. So, they can't get married under the law, but they can have, and they do have, things. So they were happy about their thing. These guys are now, this is a couple, I shouldn't say a couple, a triple or whatever, and they want to get married. A throuple. And meaning literally you could have all kinds of different configurations and so forth, right? Has the Supreme Court ever ruled on this issue? Here we go, Reynolds versus United States from Utah back in 1879. They made the argument, people from the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints, when polygamy was okay, but they made the argument that they had a First Amendment right, free exercise of religion, to actually have a marriage, multiple marriages. Supreme Court threw him in jail. And he challenged it and he lost. Mr. Reynolds lost. Okay? So, what kinds of things could potentially come up? Well, let's take a look here. Sister wives.
We met. I guess I was just young and in love. He and I both.
They're working on changing public opinion about polygamy.
I just fell in love, and then I fell in love again, and then I fell in love again.
This is Cody's
4 times.
child.
She's a sister from the same mister, and he's a brother from another mother.
Some people think, how do you feel when he's off with another woman and you know they're having sex? Well, gosh darn it, they better. I think we're normal, and I'm going, oh yeah, I can't tell everybody about my normal family.
So I got to stop it right there, because this was kind of what happened when a 4th one came in.
Robin, they got engaged and everything.
Number 4.
Oh, that's nice, they're engaged now, so now it's more official. Like a month later, I found out that Cody sealed the engagement with a kiss. And I'm we didn't kiss until over the altar.
He kissed his 4th wife.
I was kissing a married man. And so to me, the fact that he had kissed Robin, it was devastating.
When Cody asked me to marry him, and I said yes, he kissed me, and I was like, all right, well, it's done.
Oh.
And I found out that Kristen was upset.
Oh no. Here we go. Here we go.